parking lot was quiet that Thursday evening. December 1st, 1994. Fort Smith, Arkansas. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into the bones like a warning you ignored. The streetlights over Bowling World on South 36th Street cast that orange-yellow glow, the kind that makes everything look almost safe. Cars dotted the lot. People were inside, laughing, the hollow thunder of bowling pins echoing through the walls. It was a normal Thursday. The kind of Thursday that happens in thousands of small American towns every single week. Nothing about it suggested violence. Nothing about it whispered danger. And that is perhaps the most chilling thing of all. Because somewhere between 6:30 and 7 o'clock that evening, a 19-year-old girl parked her white 1995 Mitsubishi in that lot, stepped out into the cold air, and was never seen alive again. Her name was Melissa Witt, but everyone who loved her called her Missy. On the pavement, investigators would later find a gold hoop earring, a crushed hair clip, her car keys, stained with blood that nobody noticed until it was too late, and a trail of blood leading from the back of her car across the asphalt to where another vehicle had been parked. A vehicle that was already gone. She never even made it inside. 6 weeks later, 45 miles away, deep inside the Ozark National Forest where the trees crowd so thick they swallow daylight whole, 2 hunters stumbled upon something that would shatter an entire community. And more than 3 decades later, the person responsible has never been brought to justice. This is the story of Melissa Missy Witt, a story about a young woman, an ordinary evening, and a monster who has never been named. A story that is still happening, right now, in real time, because Missy's killer is still out there. Before we dive in, drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear Missy's story. Every share is one more chance that the right person sees this, and after 30 years, Missy deserves that chance. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Fort Smith, Arkansas sits right at the Oklahoma border, cradled by the Arkansas River, with the Ozark Mountains rising in the distance like silent witnesses. In 1994, it was a city of roughly 73,000 people, tight-knit in the way that small American cities are, where everybody's business is eventually everybody else's business, where people recognize faces at the grocery store, where a girl like Missy Witt could walk into a room and have 6 people shout her name. That kind of city. A city that believed it was safe enough. Melissa Witt was born on April 20th, 1975. She grew up in Fort Smith with her mother, Marion Witt, who raised her largely on her own. And by every single account, every friend, every classmate, every teacher, every person who crossed her path, Missy was exceptional. Not in a larger-than-life, destined for celebrity way, but in the quieter, more permanent way that actually matters. She was the kind of person who made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. Warm, attentive, kind. She was an honors student at Westark Community College, now the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith, where she was studying toward her dream of becoming a dental hygienist. She worked part-time at a local dental clinic, already learning the trade, already building the life she had carefully mapped out for herself. She was not the kind of person who drifted. She was the kind of person who made plans and kept them. Former reporter Charlene Shirk, who covered the case for KFSM-CBS and was later interviewed for the Hulu documentary, At Wit's End, The Hunt for a Killer, described Missy in terms that stop you cold. She said, she was an ambassador to her college, which meant the college had her go and recruit students because they wanted students like her. She worked after school. She was already a hard worker. She had big dreams for her life. She wanted to meet her mom at bowling, at a bowling church league. It's everything we're told to do as young people. Get a good education, work hard, have a good close relationship with your parents, and be a good kid. That last line, let that land. Missy Witt was doing everything right. She and her mother, Mary Ann, were close in that particular way of single-parent households where the bond between mother and child becomes something rare and fierce and total. They shared a home. They shared routines. Mary Ann bowled in a league at Bowling World on Thursday evenings, and it was not unusual for Missy to show up and join her mother for dinner afterward. It was just one of their things. One of those small, recurring rituals that stitch a family together. Her best friends described her as loyal and fun, someone who had plans, actual concrete plans for her future. Tara Limbird, one of Missy's closest friends, would later recall that the two of them had plans to meet up the very next day, on Friday, December 2nd. Nothing extraordinary, just two friends with plans. Nothing about Missy Witt's life suggested danger. Nothing about it suggested that Thursday evening would be the last day her mother would ever see her walk out the front door. And yet, December 1st, 1994 started as any other day did for Missy. She had a small disagreement with her mother that morning. Minor, the kind couples and families have every single day. Missy had asked her mom if she could borrow some money. Marion said no. And that was it. No blow-up. No drama. Just a quiet no, the way parents sometimes have to do. Before leaving for campus, Marion left Missy a note. A note that was both apology and love letter in the way only mothers can manage. She wrote that she loved her and that she would be at Bowling World later that afternoon if Missy wanted to come by and get something to eat. It was just a note on a kitchen counter. Paper and ink. But it would become one of the most heartbreaking objects in this entire story, because that note is what sent Missy to that parking lot. She went to class. She went to work at the dental clinic. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Missy finished her shift and headed to her car, only to find that it wouldn't start. A dead battery. She waited with a friend, and eventually, a good Samaritan from a nearby business came over and helped jump the car. A small delay. An inconvenience. Nothing more. She thanked them, drove home, changed out of her work clothes, and sometime after 6 p.m., she got back into that white Mitsubishi and headed toward Bowling World on South 36th Street. She was going to surprise her mom. She was going to get a free burger and spend a little time laughing. She was 19 years old and heading toward the most ordinary evening imaginable. She pulled into the parking lot between 6:30 and 7 p.m. She turned off the engine. She got out of the car. And that was the last moment that Missy Witt existed in the world as a free person. Investigators later pieced together what likely happened in the next few seconds. They believe a man was already in that parking lot. Already watching. Already waiting. That he approached Missy, and that when she rejected him, a struggle erupted, loud, violent, fast. They believe he struck her in the head with a blunt object, hard enough to draw significant blood. Then he dragged her, incapacitated or unconscious, to his own vehicle. The trail of blood from the back of her Mitsubishi to the empty space where another car had been parked tells that story without a word. Retired Fort Smith Police Detective J.C. Ryder, the lead investigator on the case, put it plainly. The trail led from the back of her car over to where the bad guy's car was parked. In seconds. She was taken in seconds. And here is where this story turns from tragic to something else entirely. Because at the time of that abduction, in those chaotic, violent seconds in that parking lot, there were witnesses. There were people who were right there. A man was standing outside the front entrance of Bowling World, smoking. He was short. He had a mustache and wore glasses. He had on a blue shirt, jeans, brown boots, and a white or light-colored baseball cap. Investigators believe this man almost certainly heard, and possibly saw, the loud altercation between Missy and her attacker. A family was crossing that same parking lot at that same time. A couple and their child, a child between 8 and 10 years old. The woman was short and blonde with what witnesses described as fluffy hair. She wore a tan or light-colored striped sweater. The man with her was taller. 2 witnesses. Both of them right there. Both of them, to this day, 30 years later, completely unidentified. Why? Why have these people never come forward? Did they leave Fort Smith that same week? Did they not understand what they saw? Are they still out there somewhere, holding a piece of this story that could end it? That question has haunted investigators for 3 decades, and it should haunt us too. Because by the time anyone realized something was wrong, those witnesses had disappeared into the ordinary machinery of their lives, and Missy Witt was already gone. That is where we are, right now, at the beginning of this story. A parking lot. A trail of blood. Keys on the ground. An earring in the cold. And a mother who was inside, 40 feet away, happily bowling, who had no idea her daughter had come to find her, and had vanished instead. The evening ended. Mary and Witt went home. Missy wasn't there. She assumed she'd gone out with friends. This was, after all, a 19-year-old woman with a social life. Mary and wasn't alarmed. Not yet. But the hours kept passing, and the silence kept growing. And somewhere out there, in the dark, a man was driving away from Fort Smith with Missy Witt in his car. Stay with us. Because what the search that followed revealed, and what was found 45 miles away on January 13, 1995, is even more devastating than this beginning. By midnight, Mary and Witt was no longer calm. She had started making calls. Friends, classmates, anyone who might know where Missy was, anyone who might have seen her or heard from her. Phone after phone rang into the dark. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had seen her. And with each call that ended in nothing, the knot in Marian's chest pulled tighter. Tara Limbird, Missy's closest friend, was asleep when her phone rang that night. She would later recall being pulled out of a dead sleep by the fear in Marian's voice. That sharp, controlled panic of a mother who already knows something is wrong, but isn't ready to say it out loud. Tara hadn't seen Missy. She'd talked to her earlier that day, made plans for the next morning. Missy had been fine. Happy even. But Missy wasn't answering. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Mary and Witt was in her car, driving through the dark streets of Fort Smith. Not to any particular destination. Just driving. Looking. The way parents do when the mind refuses to accept what the body already senses. She drove past places Missy liked to go. Past friends' houses. Past the bowling alley on South 36th Street, where the parking lot was now empty and quiet, and still, nothing left on the asphalt that the night hadn't hidden. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just kept driving. At approximately 9 a.m. on the morning of December 2nd, Mary and Witt called the Fort Smith Police Department and reported her daughter missing. The investigation that followed moved quickly, because from the very beginning, officers sensed that this was not a case of a young woman who had simply run off. Missy wasn't that kind of person. She had class. She had work. She had plans with Tara the very next morning. And she had left everything behind. Her car, her keys, her earring, in a parking lot she had only just arrived at. A few days after Missy was reported missing, on December 5th, her white 1995 Mitsubishi was found in the Bowling World parking garage, right where she had left it, undisturbed. Inside and around the vehicle, investigators found what they had been dreading: blood. Blood in the parking lot itself. Blood inside the vehicle. Near the car, a gold hoop earring, one of the pair Missy had been wearing that evening, a crushed hair clip, and most hauntingly, her keys, which had already been turned in to the front desk of the bowling alley by a customer who'd found them on the ground. Nobody, at the time, had noticed the dried blood smeared across the keychain. The blood that bore Missy's name in the most brutal way possible. The keychain itself. It read Missy. It was her name. On her keys. Covered in her blood. Sitting on a lost and found counter while her mother was driving through the dark crying. Investigators immediately established their theory of what had happened, and they did not mince words. A man had been waiting in that parking lot. He had targeted Missy as she got out of her car. She had fought him. The blood, the earring, the crushed hair clip all testified to that. She had fought back. But he had overpowered her, struck her in the head, and dragged her to his car. The blood trail pointed to exactly where his vehicle had been parked before he drove away. Retired Detective J.C. Ryder, who spent more than 2 decades trying to solve this case, would describe the scene with a controlled grief that still comes through every interview. She was running low on money. She was going to come out and have her mother buy her a hamburger. A hamburger. That's what this night was about. A girl who wanted to see her mom and get something to eat. And the trail of blood across the asphalt told the rest of the story that no words could finish. Meanwhile, the community of Fort Smith was already beginning to fracture with fear. Word spread the way it does in cities that size. Fast, distorted, terrifying. A college girl, taken from a parking lot. No warning. No reason. No suspect. The kind of thing that makes people check their locks twice, makes parents call their kids, makes women rethink the routes they take and the places they park. Because if it could happen to Missy Witt, Missy, who everyone knew, who everyone loved, who did everything right, it could happen to anyone. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people. In the weeks following Missy's disappearance, according to contemporary news reports, over 100 sex offenders and possible suspects were brought in and interviewed. Every lead was chased. Every tip was logged. The fact that Bowling World had no security cameras in its parking lot, and that the cameras in surrounding buildings captured nothing useful, meant that investigators were working almost entirely from physical evidence and human testimony. And the human testimony was frustratingly thin. Those 2 witnesses, the man with the mustache and glasses, the family with the young child. They had to have seen something, or heard something. The altercation, investigators believed, was loud, violent, not the kind of thing that blends into the background. And yet, silence. The search expanded. Volunteers joined law enforcement on foot searches through neighborhoods, fields, rural areas surrounding Fort Smith. Flyers with Missy's face went up in storefronts, on telephone poles, on every surface that would hold tape. Her photograph, that warm, open smile, became a fixture of the River Valley winter. The kind of presence that made people look twice at their own daughters and thank God. December bled into the last weeks of the year. Christmas approached. The kind of holiday season that Missy should have spent at home with her mother, exchanging gifts, making food, doing all the things that feel small until they are gone. Instead, Mary and Witt spent Christmas not knowing whether her daughter was alive, not knowing where she was, not knowing if she was cold or afraid or in pain. The kind of not knowing that is its own specific torture, distinct from grief, worse in some ways because it has no floor, no bottom, no end. And then December ended, and January began, and the Ozark National Forest, 45 miles from Fort Smith, kept its secret a little while longer. The Ozark National Forest covers more than 1 million acres of rugged, ancient wilderness in northwestern and north-central Arkansas. It is beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful, vast, wild, unconcerned with human suffering. Turner Bend, in Franklin County, is a particularly remote stretch of it. The kind of place where the trails are overgrown and the silence is thick enough to feel solid. A place where a person could leave something in the woods and trust that the woods would keep it. January 13th, 1995. Two hunters were moving through the forest near Turner Bend when they came across something that stopped them cold. A young woman's body, nude, lying face down in the cold earth, in front of a rock formation that, by cruel coincidence or deliberate staging, resembled a headstone. They called the authorities. When law enforcement arrived and secured the scene, they confirmed what everyone had been afraid to say for 43 days. Through dental records, Missy's dental records, from the clinic where she had worked, where she had learned and laughed and planned her future, the body was identified as that of Melissa and Witt. She had been strangled. She had been taken from a parking lot 45 miles away, carried into this wilderness, and left here, in the cold, in front of a rock that looked like a grave marker. Her clothing was gone. Her shoes were gone. Her jewelry was gone. And her Mickey Mouse watch, a brown-banded Mickey Mouse watch that was one of her signature accessories, was gone. Taken. A trophy, investigators suspected. Something the killer kept. No weapon was found. No forensic trail pointing to a name. Cigarette butts and scraps of paper were found near the body. But in 1995, DNA forensics was in its infancy and the evidence was limited. The body had been in the forest for more than 6 weeks. The elements had taken their toll. Investigators noted something else, something that deepened the unease around the case. The indentations in the earth near the rock formation suggested that Missy's body had initially been placed behind the rock, out of sight, hidden, and then it had been moved, repositioned, closer to the road, closer to where it might be discovered. Someone had moved it. Whether it was the killer returning to the scene, or a local person who had stumbled upon it and wanted her to be found, investigators could not determine. But the implication was clear. This crime scene had been disturbed. Someone else had been here. She could have screamed as loud as she could, retired Detective J.C. Ryder said. Years later, his voice carrying the weight of every moment he had spent in that forest and in that case, and no one would have heard her. Fort Smith broke when the news came. The fear that had been building for 6 weeks converted, in an instant, into grief. Mary and Witt learned that her daughter, the girl she had raised alone, the girl she had left a note for on the kitchen counter, the girl who had just wanted a hamburger and a little time with her mom, had been murdered, strangled, left in a forest like she was nothing. She was everything. She was someone's whole world. And now the question shifted. It was no longer where is Missy, it was who did this. And it was a question that, to this day, 30 years on, has not been answered. But the search for the answer, and the people who dedicated their lives to it, is a story almost as remarkable as Missy herself. We are only at the beginning. Because the investigation that followed would uncover a world of violence simmering beneath the surface of Fort Smith, a world of predators and suspects and dead ends, a world that would eventually lead investigators to one of the most chilling suspects in Arkansas criminal history. Stay with us, because what comes next will change everything you think you know about this case. There is a particular kind of agony that belongs only to families of murder victims in unsolved cases. It is different from the grief of those who lose their loved ones to illness or accident or even solved crimes. Those griefs have edges. They have timelines. They allow, eventually, for a form of forward movement, however painful. But the grief of an unsolved murder has no edges. It loops back on itself endlessly. Every unanswered question is a wound that stays open. Every year that passes without justice is an anniversary of the very worst day of your life, served fresh, with no end in sight. Mary and Witt lived inside that grief for years. She became a fixture in the search for Missy's killer, speaking to media, cooperating with investigators, never letting the case go cold in her own heart, even when the headlines moved on. She raised billboards. She answered questions. She carried a photograph of her daughter the way other people carry their whole identity, because for Mary and Missy was her whole identity. She was the reason for everything. The investigators who worked the case carried their own version of that weight. J.C. Ryder, the retired Fort Smith Police Department detective who served as lead investigator, was not someone who let cases lie once he retired. He kept working the Missy Witt case long after he had turned in his badge, the way some detectives do when a case becomes more than a case. It becomes a debt, a moral obligation, an open promise to a girl who will never know whether it was kept. "It's all I've ever wanted out of this," Ryder said in 2021, his voice worn with years, to see justice served. In the weeks and months, and then years following the discovery of Missy's body, law enforcement pieced together a portrait of the crime that was remarkably detailed given how little hard evidence they had. They believed the killer was organized, not disorganized, not impulsive in a chaotic way. Someone who had planned, or at least opportunistically taken advantage of a moment in a calculated way. The distance between the abduction site and the body discovery site, 45 miles, spoke to that. A frenzied, impulsive killer doesn't drive 45 miles into a national forest. He doesn't place a body behind a rock formation. He doesn't take the clothing, the shoes, the jewelry, the watch. Those behaviors spoke to someone who understood evidence, who understood the need to leave as little trace as possible, and who had reason to know the Ozark National Forest well enough to choose that specific location. The taking of the Mickey Mouse watch was particularly significant to investigators. The watch was distinctive, personal. The killer did not need to take it for any practical reason. He took it because he wanted it. And in the language of criminal psychology, that kind of trophy-taking tells a story about a killer who wanted to preserve the memory of what he had done, who wanted something tangible to return to. That watch has never been found. Somewhere out there, today, that brown-banded Mickey Mouse watch still exists. It is in a drawer or a box, or buried in a yard, or sitting forgotten on a shelf. And whoever has it knows exactly what it means. Meanwhile, the investigation in those early years was broad and relentless in the way that high-profile cases sometimes force departments to be. Hundreds of sex offenders were interviewed. Tips poured in. The community remained alert, watching, suspicious of everyone and everything. But the leads either dead-ended or pointed nowhere provable. Without DNA technology mature enough to process what little biological evidence existed, and without those two critical witnesses ever coming forward, investigators were working with one hand tied behind their backs. Then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. Not because of a new witness. Not because someone finally came forward. But because of a monster who was caught in the act of doing exactly what investigators believed he had done to Missy Witt. His name was Charles Ray Vines. To the people of Fort Smith, Charles Ray Vines looked like a neighbor. Born and raised in the city. A man who had gotten married in 1985 and had 2 sons. Someone who took his kids hunting and fishing. Someone you might nod to at the gas station without a second thought. But beneath that performance of normalcy was something dark and violent and predatory that he had been hiding, apparently, for years. In April 1993, an 89-year-old legally blind woman named Lily Jones was brutally beaten and raped in her Fort Smith home. She survived. Then in 1993, 58-year-old Juanita Wofford was raped and stabbed to death in her home near the railroad tracks off Jenny Lind Road in Fort Smith. The brutality of the crime was staggering. A year and a half later, in August 1995, a 74-year-old woman named Ruth Henderson was raped and stabbed to death in Crawford County, just across the county line from Fort Smith, in a manner eerily similar to Wofford's murder. Fort Smith had a serial killer, and it didn't know it yet. The investigation into both murders was chaotic and, for a period, went in the wrong direction entirely. Police initially arrested a man named Danny Bennett, who confessed to the crimes. He was held while investigators worked to close the case. Then Ron Fields, who served as prosecutor for Sebastian and Crawford counties from 1978 to 1995, got a call that upended everything. Another woman had been murdered. The DNA from the crime scenes didn't match Bennett. Fields told police they had the wrong man. The response he got back, months later, stayed with him. "Gee, we want to apologize. You were right. Danny Bennett didn't do it. We've got a guy named Charles Vines." They had Charles Ray Vines because in March 2000, he broke into the home of a 16-year-old girl, raped her, and attempted to kill her. Her stepfather arrived while the attack was still happening and, in a rage, tried to beat Vines to death before sheriff's deputies arrived and intervened. Vines was taken into custody. DNA testing matched him to the murders of Juanita Wofford and Ruth Henderson. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And then investigators turned around and looked at the calendar. November and December 1994. The same window of time as Missy Witt's abduction. Charles Ray Vines was in Fort Smith. He was active. He was hunting women. He had a pattern of attacking females of wildly different ages. His method, assault, sexual violence, murder, concealment, overlapped in critical ways with what had happened to Missy. Former prosecutor Ron Fields said it directly. A rapist who murders and does it over and over again is incredibly rare, so you've got to look at him in other cases. He said Vines should be considered a suspect in virtually every sex crime in the area where the victim ended up dead, including the cases of Missy Witt and missing 6-year-old Morgan Nick, who vanished from Alma, Arkansas in June 1995, just 6 months after Missy. And then the witness came forward. Years after the case first made headlines, a woman emailed a detective with a detail she had apparently held for years. She worked with Vines' mother, and Charles Ray Vines used to show up at his mother's workplace from time to time. And on one of those occasions, this witness had seen him wearing something distinctive. A bowling league shirt. Let that register. A bowling league shirt. At a bowling alley on South 36th Street. The very bowling alley where Missy Witt was abducted. The killer or someone connected to the crime could have been a regular. Could have known the layout. Could have known when league nights happened, when the parking lot would be full and loud and distracting enough to cover a violent act. FBI agents Rob Allen and Reuben Gay, who took on a fresh investigation into the Witt case in 2019, focused heavily on Vines. They re-examined everything. They discovered that Vines had done a work order, a documented, verified work order, at a location that was within an 8-minute drive of the spot in the Ozark National Forest where Missy's body had been found. He knew those woods. He had been there. He had been close enough that the geography of the crime made terrifying sense. Allen and Gay requested an interview with Vines. They wanted to sit across from him and ask him, directly, whether he had killed Melissa Witt. But Vines was already dying. By 2019, his health had deteriorated significantly in the maximum security unit at the Pine Bluff prison. The FBI agents traveled to see him, hoping to extract a confession or at least some kind of break in the case. What they found was a man too ill to speak in any meaningful way. The interview produced nothing. On September 5, 2019, Charles Ray Vines died of natural causes in prison. He took whatever he knew, whatever he did or didn't do, to his grave. An FBI profiler who examined the Witt case did conclude, however, that Vines did not match the profile of Missy's killer. The method of the crime, the type of victim, the behavioral signatures, they didn't line up precisely with Vines's established pattern. Vines killed elderly women in their homes. Missy was young, taken from a public place, transported far from the abduction site. The profiles were different enough that investigators couldn't, and still cannot, definitively place Vines at that parking lot. And so the door that seemed like it might finally open closed again. And Mary and Witt waited. And J.C. Ryder kept working. And the Mickey Mouse watch remained wherever it was. And the answer stayed hidden. But Charles Ray Vines was not the only name that investigators were watching. There was another man whose shadow had been hanging over this case from almost the beginning. A man who had lived near Missy Witt in 1994. A man who had never provided a credible alibi for the night she was taken. A man whose history of violence against women was documented and specific and deeply disturbing. His name was Travis Crouch, and his story would add yet another layer of darkness to a case already thick with it. Travis Dale Crouch was not a name that appeared in the news for good reasons. He was an Arkansas native who, by the time Missy Witt vanished in December of 1994, had already accumulated a criminal history that should have been alarming to anyone paying attention. He had been released from prison in another state and relocated to Arkansas, specifically to Fort Smith, specifically to a neighborhood close to where Missy Witt lived. He knew the area. He knew the town. He was not a man who announced his presence. He was a man who moved through spaces quietly, watching. What investigators could establish was damning in its circumstantial weight. Crouch was in Fort Smith at the time of Missy's abduction. He had no confirmed alibi for the evening of December 1st, 1994. According to records, he had never provided investigators with an alibi they could verify. He had a documented history of violence against women that was not vague or minor. It was specific and escalating, the kind of pattern that criminologists study in courses about predatory behavior. The crime that eventually put Travis Crouch away was chillingly similar in its mechanics to what happened to Missy Witt. He was convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a woman he had encountered in a mall parking lot. A parking lot. A public place. A woman alone, approached and overwhelmed in a space that should have been safe. The echo of what happened to Missy Witt in that bowling alley parking lot was audible to anyone listening. Travis Crouch is currently incarcerated in Colorado for that crime. He has never been charged in connection with Missy's murder. Investigators could not connect him to the physical evidence. But they also never cleared him. And a man who kidnaps women from parking lots, who lived near Missy Witt in 1994, who cannot account for his whereabouts on the night she was taken, that is not a name you put in a closed file. While investigators were circling these suspects, the world of forensic science was slowly, agonizingly catching up to the case. DNA technology, which had been in its infancy in 1994 and 1995, had evolved dramatically by the late 2010s. And in 2019, when FBI agents Rob Allen and Reuben Gay relaunched their investigation into Missy's case with fresh eyes and modern tools, they were working with capabilities that simply hadn't existed when J.C. Ryder first stood in that parking lot 25 years earlier. Allen and Gay did something that had not been done in the 2.5 decades since Missy's body was discovered. They went back to Turner Bend. They went back to that patch of the Ozark National Forest, to the spot where Missy had been left 27 years after the hunters had found her there. They brought forensic cadaver dogs, trained animals whose entire biological purpose is to detect decomposition, scent, the invisible residue of the dead. They wanted to know what the site still held. They wanted to know if modern methods could find something the 1995 investigators had missed. The working group, Fort Smith PD and FBI, went out to the dump site of Melissa Witt, and this was 27 years later after she had been located. Agent Allen described in the documentary. The test was, what would we see if we ran the dogs on this site, where decomposition had happened? What would that even look like? And it was admittedly just a test, out of curiosity. The dogs ran the site. They also investigated locations connected to Charles Ray Vines, places he had lived, places he had frequented, places that might still carry his scent signature alongside Missy's if he had been the one to carry her into those woods. The results of those canine tests were fed into the larger evidentiary picture, weighed against everything else known about Vines and Crouch, and every other name that had ever appeared in the file. But this case has always been defined by what it doesn't have as much as what it does. No murder weapon. No confirmed suspect. No DNA match on file. No witness who ever came forward with a name or a plate number or a face clear enough to build a case around. Just a trail of blood across asphalt, a missing watch, and a body in a forest that was already 30 years old before anyone outside of Arkansas started paying it the attention it deserved. And then came the other case. The case that made investigators stop and look at a map of Arkansas and Texas and feel something cold slide down the backs of their necks. In December 1998, a 19-year-old student named Melissa Trotter vanished from Montgomery College in Conroe, Texas. Her body was found 25 days later in the Sam Houston National Forest. She had been strangled with her own pantyhose and sexually assaulted. The last person seen with her at the college library was a man named Larry Swearingen. The parallels to Missy Witt's case landed like a fist. Both victims named Melissa. Both 19 years old at the time of their deaths. Both college students. Both strangled. Both found in large national forests. Their bodies disposed of in remote wooded areas far from where they were last seen. Both cases defined by a killer who planned, who transported, who concealed. Marcus Blair, a reporter at the Southwest Times-Record in Fort Smith, came across a front-page article in a Houston newspaper about Melissa Trotter and Larry Swearingen, and immediately recognized the similarities to Missy Witt. He contacted the Fort Smith Police Department. Investigators there learned that Swearingen had not only murdered Melissa Trotter in Texas, he had also been tracked as being in Clinton, Arkansas during November 1994, weeks before Missy Witt was taken. Within range, Larry Swearingen was convicted of Melissa Trotter's murder and sentenced to death in Texas. He maintained his innocence in every murder, Trotter's, Witt's, any case that was ever floated near his name, until the very end. He was executed on January 27, 2009. He never admitted to anything. No charges were ever brought against Swearingen in connection with Missy Witt's case. The evidence tying him to the Bowling World parking lot on December 1, 1994 was compelling in its circumstantial weight, but absent in the hard, evidentiary sense. He was in the state. He had a documented pattern. He killed a girl with the same name, the same age, in the same way, in the same kind of place. But compelling coincidence is not a conviction, and the justice system requires more than coincidence. So now the roster stands as this: 3 significant names. Charles Ray Vines, dead in prison since 2019, FBI profiler notwithstanding his profile match to the crime. Larry Swearingen, executed in 2019, who denied everything until his last breath. Travis Crouch, alive in a Colorado prison, who has never been cleared. And the 2 unidentified witnesses in that parking lot, who have never come forward, who may or may not know what they saw, who are somewhere in the world right now living their lives while the file on Missy Witt sits open. 3 decades. Multiple agencies. FBI involvement. Modern forensics. A Hulu documentary, At Witt's End, The Hunt for a Killer, executive produced by Ridley Scott, and streaming as of August 2024, that laid out the entire investigation in forensic detail for a national audience. A $29,000 reward. Billboards on the most traveled roads in Fort Smith. A Facebook page called Who Killed Missy Witt that has gathered thousands of followers who refuse to let the story end. And still, no arrest, no conviction, no answer. But there is something powerful about the people who have refused to let this case die. Not just law enforcement, though their commitment has been extraordinary. There is a woman named LaDonna Humphrey, an Oklahoma native who moved to Arkansas in the late 1980s, an award-winning writer and investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker, who became the loudest civilian voice for Missy Witt when Mary and no longer could be. LaDonna Humphrey is not related to Missy. She has no personal connection to the case in the way that blood or history would define. What she has is something harder to categorize, a conviction, almost physical in its intensity, that Missy Witt's story deserves to be told and retold until somebody, somewhere, finally gives up whatever they know. She founded the Facebook page. She organized the billboard campaign. She partnered with advocacy groups. She connected with journalists and detectives and documentary filmmakers. She became, in the truest sense, Missy's voice after Mary, and was gone. She was 19. Humphrey has said, simply and directly. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend. It could be any of us next time. It could be any of us next time. Those words carry more weight than they might seem to at first. Because Fort Smith, Arkansas is not some extraordinary place where extraordinary violence happens. It is an ordinary American city where an ordinary girl parked her car in an ordinary parking lot and was murdered. The extraordinary part is everything that came after. The extraordinary part is 30 years of unanswered questions, of a mother who died without knowing who killed her child, of a case that refuses to close because justice refuses to be satisfied with silence. And through all of it, through every cold lead and every revived hope and every new theory, and every dead end, one object has remained at the symbolic center of the case. A Mickey Mouse watch. Brown band. The kind a 19-year-old girl would wear because she liked it, because it was hers, because it was just a watch. The kind of thing you wouldn't think twice about. And somewhere tonight, that watch exists. It is real. It is physical. It is in somebody's possession, in some drawer or box or trash heap, and it connects directly to the moment that Melissa Witt's life ended. Investigators have made recovering it one of their primary public appeals, not because the watch itself is evidence of identity, but because whoever has it, whoever kept it, is holding the thread that unravels everything. The case is still open. If you know anything at all, about what happened in that parking lot on December 1st, 1994, or about the Mickey Mouse watch, or about the man who was smoking outside Bowling World that night, or about the family that was crossing the parking lot, you can call 1-800-440-1922 right now, or email whokilledmissywitt@gmail.com. The tip line is active. Investigators are still listening. But there is still more to this story that needs to be told. Mary Ann Witt was not a woman built for public life. She was quiet in the way that private people are quiet, deeply interior, carrying her grief in the way you carry something precious that you are afraid to put down in case it breaks or someone takes it from you. But she showed up. Every time the investigation needed her, every time a reporter needed a face for the story, every time a tip line needed a human being standing behind it rather than just a phone number, Mary Ann showed up. Because Missy was hers. And as long as Mary Ann was breathing, the investigation would have a human heartbeat at its center. People who knew Mary Ann in those years describe a woman aging faster than time demanded of her. The grief of unsolved murder does that. It is not only emotional weight, it is physical. It occupies the body. It alters the posture. People who have stood in that particular darkness for years look like they are carrying weather inside them, like the storm never fully passes, like the next clap of thunder is always somewhere on the horizon, always coming. She kept a photograph of Missy, the one most people recognize. Missy smiling, open-faced, the kind of smile that exists without reservation, without calculation, just pure warmth aimed at whoever was holding the camera. Mary Ann looked at that photograph every day of her life after December 1st, 1994. And every day that passed without justice was a day that photograph became both comfort and wound in equal measure. The community of Fort Smith, for its part, went through the same cycles that all communities go through after crimes of this magnitude. There was the initial shock, the collective tightening of security, the checking of locks, and the recalibration of routine. There was the sustained period of active searching and hoping, when the tips were fresh and the investigation was loud, and the newspaper ran the story on the front page. And then there was the drift, the slow, painful drift that happens when months become years and years become a decade, and suddenly you realize that Missy Witt's case has been open longer than some of the current police officers on the Fort Smith force have been alive. That drift is one of the cruelest features of cold cases. It is not indifference, exactly. Most people in Fort Smith who were alive in 1994 have not forgotten Missy. Her story is woven into the fabric of what that city knows about itself, about its own darkness, about the cost of violence left unresolved. But attention is not infinite. The human mind cannot sustain acute grief indefinitely. Life presses in. New events demand new focus. And the cold case file sits in the cabinet, and the years pile on, and the witnesses get older, and memories blur, and the people who know something might convince themselves, over time, that what they know doesn't matter anymore. That it was too long ago. That telling it now couldn't change anything. It can. It still can. That is the most important thing to understand about this case, 30 years on. Because here is what modern criminal justice has repeatedly demonstrated. Cold cases do get solved. Not always, and not easily, but they do. DNA genealogy, the technique that takes biological evidence from a crime scene and runs it through public genealogical databases to identify relatives of an unknown suspect, then works backward to the suspect themselves, has cracked cases that sat untouched for 40, 50, 60 years. Cases where witnesses were dead, where physical evidence was considered unusable, where investigators had essentially given up. The Golden State Killer case. The Zodiac Killer's partial identification. Dozens of lesser-known but equally important cases across the country. Missy's case has not been definitively solved by this technology yet, but the biological evidence collected in 1994 and 1995 still exists. It has been preserved. Modern testing can work with degraded samples that 1990s technology couldn't touch. Every year that passes brings new techniques, new databases, new computational power applied to old evidence. And there is something else. Something more immediate than DNA. Two witnesses. Let's talk about them again, plainly and directly. Because the passage of time changes things. The man who was smoking outside Bowling World on December 1st, 1994 was alive then. He is probably still alive now. He is somewhere in America. Maybe still in Fort Smith, maybe across the country. Maybe he moved the very next month and built a whole new life in a city that didn't know his name. He is a person with a daily life, with routines, with people who love him and know him. And somewhere in his memory, maybe pushed down deep, maybe not so deep, is what he saw or heard in that parking lot. Similarly, the family. The couple with the child between 8 and 10 years old. That child, in 2024, is an adult in their late 30s or early 40s. They may not remember what they saw at age 8 or 9 or 10. Or they may remember it perfectly, the kind of visceral childhood memory that lodges itself permanently in the architecture of the mind. They may have spent years not knowing what they witnessed was significant. They may have spent years knowing exactly what they witnessed and believing, for reasons private and complicated, that they could not come forward. This is the appeal, made here, made now, made in the most direct terms possible. You are not in trouble for what you saw. You cannot be prosecuted for witnessing something. The 30 years that have passed since that evening do not diminish the value of what you know. If you were in that parking lot, or if you know someone who was, that knowledge is still worth everything. Because here is the thing that gets lost in the narrative distance of cold cases. Missy Witt was a real person. She was not a headline or a Wikipedia entry or a true crime podcast subject. She was a 19-year-old girl who loved her mother, who went to class every day, who worked hard at a dental clinic and dreamed about her future, who wore a Mickey Mouse watch with a brown band, who had plans to see her best friend the very next morning. She is gone. But the question of who took her is not yet gone. And in the world of criminal justice, unanswered questions leave doors open. Doors that investigators, advocates, families, and communities can keep pushing against until something finally gives way. LaDonna Humphrey understood this in her bones. When Mary and Witt died, there was a moment, a dangerous, real moment, where Missy's case could have quietly settled into the archived section of the public's attention, where it could have become one of those stories you vaguely remember hearing about, but never revisited. Humphrey refused that outcome. She created infrastructure around the case, the Facebook page, the advocacy networks, the connections with other missing and murdered victim organizations, the billboard campaigns, the documentary development. She turned one woman's murder into a sustained public conversation that has now reached millions of people. We have a case that could easily be solved, Humphrey has said. Not solved in the sense that the answer is simple, but solved in the sense that someone out there has information. She believes her killer quite possibly could still be in the area, reporters noted of Humphrey's assessment in 2021. The killer who took Missy from that parking lot would have been, at minimum, an adult in 1994. He is likely in his 50s, 60s, or beyond now. He has been living somewhere, working somewhere, existing somewhere. He is not a ghost. He is a person, and people who know people notice things. The $29,000 reward announced in December 2023, on the 29th anniversary of Missy's abduction, is not symbolic. It is real money for real information. The reward structure is designed to prioritize two specific things: any information that leads to the recovery of Missy's Mickey Mouse watch, or any information that leads to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible, and any information that helps identify the smoking man or the couple and child in the parking lot. That is 4 categories of information that someone out there could provide today. Not 30 years ago. Today. Right now. While you are watching this, someone in America, possibly someone who doesn't even know they matter, holds a piece of this puzzle. And if this video reaches the right person, or if it reaches someone who knows that person, everything could change. If you have any information about the murder of Melissa Witt, call 1-800-440-1922 right now. Don't wait. Don't second-guess whether what you know is important enough. Let investigators make that determination. just call. And if this story is reaching you for the first time and you want to follow what happens with this case going forward, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. Because if there is a break in this case, we will cover it immediately and you will want to be here for it. Because this story is not over. The investigation is active. Multiple agencies, the Fort Smith Police Department, Crawford County, Sebastian County, Van Buren Police Department, and the FBI, are still collaborating on this case. The forensic tests ordered by agents Allen and Gay as part of their 2019 reinvestigation are still being processed through the system. New leads still arrive. The community is still watching. Missy is still waiting. But let's go back to one more dimension of this story that we have not yet fully explored. Because the Missy Witt case did not exist in isolation. It existed inside a specific moment in a specific place, in an Arkansas that was being terrorized by at least one known predator, and possibly more, during the exact same period that Missy was killed. The river valley of Arkansas has a particular character to it. Slow rivers, dense tree cover, the kind of landscape that holds its history close and reveals it reluctantly. Fort Smith sits at the heart of it, where the Arkansas River bends and the state touches Oklahoma. A border town in the truest sense, where people pass through and settle and sometimes disappear. In the 1990s, this river valley was something it kept largely to itself. It was being hunted. To understand the full darkness of what surrounds the Missy Witt case, you have to understand the specific atmosphere of violence that was alive in this region during those years. Because Charles Ray Vines was not operating in isolation. Because Morgan Nick would vanish from nearby almost 6 months after Missy. Because the connections between violent predators, geographic proximity, and overlapping timelines create a web of criminal activity in this region during the mid-1990s that investigators are still trying to fully map 30 years later. Charles Ray Vines grew up in Fort Smith. He was born there, raised there, married there. He was, by outward appearances, a member of the community in good standing. A man who took his sons fishing, who was liked by neighbors, who fit into the ordinary fabric of small city life with such unremarkable smoothness that nothing in his daily behavior would have flagged him to anyone watching. But Vines had been building toward violence for years. A history of domestic abuse against his wife, who divorced him in 1989. Physical abuse of his own sons. A capacity for cruelty that he had apparently been managing or mismanaging in private for the duration of his adult life. And then, in April 1993, that capacity for cruelty found its first external victim, Lily Jones, an 89-year-old legally blind woman who was beaten and raped in her own home. Jones survived. She was 89 years old, legally blind, and she survived what Charles Ray Vines did to her. That survival is its own form of testimony to her toughness, and also to the indiscriminate brutality of the man who attacked her. Vines was not selecting victims based on their ability to resist. He was selecting them based on their vulnerability and his access to them. A few months later, in 1993, Juanita Wofford, 58 years old, living near the railroad tracks off Jenny Lind Road in Fort Smith, was raped and stabbed to death in her home. The crime was savage. The investigation that followed became confused, as noted earlier, by the false confession of an innocent man named Danny Bennett who spent months in custody, while Vines continued to exist in the community as if nothing had happened. Then, on August 10, 1995, 8 months after Missy Witt was abducted, 74-year-old Ruth Henderson was raped and stabbed to death in Crawford County. The same methodology, the same signature, the same monster moving through the river valley, invisible to the investigation that was looking in the wrong direction. Consider the timeline carefully. Lily Jones attacked, April 1993. Juanita Wofford murdered, 1993. Melissa Witt abducted and murdered, December 1994. Ruth Henderson murdered, August 1995. These crimes do not form a neat sequence that points inward at itself. They point outward, toward the question, what else happened that isn't in any file? Former prosecutor Ron Fields asked that question publicly and without equivocation. He stated that a predator who rapes and murders repeatedly is extraordinarily rare, and that investigators are obligated to look at such a predator for every unsolved violent crime in the geographic area during the period of his known activity. He explicitly named Missy Witt. He explicitly named Morgan Nick. He was not speculating carelessly. He was applying the logic of criminal profiling to a documented pattern of behavior in a defined geographic region. And then there is the bowling shirt. That detail that emerged years later, from a woman who had worked with Vines's mother and had seen him wearing what appeared to be a bowling league shirt. Bowling World on South 36th Street ran leagues on Thursday evenings. Mary and Witt was in one of those leagues. The parking lot in the evening would have been full of people associated with those leagues, members, families, drivers dropping people off. If Charles Ray Vines was connected to that bowling alley in any way, the connection is not incidental. It is structural. But the FBI profiler looked at the Witt crime and looked at Vines's established pattern and rendered a conclusion that investigators could not ignore. The profiles didn't match. Vines attacked elderly women in their homes. The Witt crime was a parking lot abduction of a young woman, followed by transport and disposal in a national forest. The methodologies were different enough that the profiler did not believe Vines was responsible. That conclusion has not been universally accepted. Former prosecutor Fields and others have argued that a predator at an earlier stage in his evolution might exhibit behavior different from his later, more established pattern. That what looked different about the Witt crime might simply reflect Vines at a moment of opportunism, when circumstances deviated from his usual approach. That argument has merit. It is not proof, but it has merit. And so the case exists in this particular limbo. Multiple suspects, all dead or incarcerated. No forensic confirmation connecting any name to the crime. An FBI reinvestigation launched in 2019 with modern tools that has produced results still being processed. A victim whose identity and humanity have been amplified in recent years to a national audience by a Hulu documentary and a decades-long advocacy campaign. And a killer who has never been publicly identified, who may or may not still be alive, who may or may not have continued to harm people after Missy. Here is what is known with certainty. What is not speculation, not inference, not profiling, just fact. Missy Witt was 19 years old. She was abducted from a parking lot in Fort Smith, Arkansas on December 1, 1994. She was killed and her body was left in the Ozark National Forest, found on January 13, 1995. She was strangled. Her clothing, shoes, and jewelry, including her Mickey Mouse watch, were taken. No one has ever been arrested for her murder. The case is active. The tip line is real. The reward is real. The watch is still out there. That is the foundation. That is what we know for absolute certain after 30 years. And surrounding that foundation is a story of a community that refused to let her be forgotten. Let's talk about what that looked like in practice, because the advocacy work done in Missy's name over the past 3 decades is as remarkable, in its own way, as any development in the forensic investigation. The billboard campaign launched by All the Lost Girls in November 2021 put Missy's face on 4 of the most heavily traveled roads in Fort Smith. Large format billboards. Her photograph. Her dates. The tip line number. Thousands of people drove past those billboards every day. People who might have been children in 1994 and were now adults with adult memories. People who had moved to Fort Smith after 1994 and had never heard the story but now would. People who might recognize something in Missy's face or in the case details that connected to something they had always wondered about. The Facebook page, Who Killed Missy Witt, created by LaDonna Humphrey, grew into a genuine community of people invested in the case. Not in a morbid or exploitative way, but in the earnest and often deeply touching way that communities form around justice. People shared memories of Missy. People shared theories. People posted new information when it emerged. And people, consistently and persistently, kept the tip line visible, kept the watch description visible, kept the witness descriptions visible. Because the most powerful thing a civilian community can do for a cold case is make sure the information stays in circulation. Make sure the right person eventually sees it. The documentary, At Wit's End, The Hunt for a Killer, elevated the case to a national level that no local billboard campaign, however well executed, could achieve alone. Produced by ABC News Studios and Scott Free Productions, Scott Free being Ridley Scott's production company, the same producer behind films like Alien, Blade Runner, and Gladiator, and streaming on Hulu beginning August 6, 2024, the 4-part series brought the full complexity of the Witt investigation to an audience of millions. People who had never heard of Fort Smith, Arkansas. People who had never known Missy's name. People who might know something, or know someone who knows something, or who might simply carry this story forward into conversations that eventually reached the right ears. The show's release generated an enormous wave of renewed attention. New tips, new interviews requested by investigators, new media coverage across national platforms. Every one of those tips is currently sitting in an active file, being evaluated by detectives who have spent years working this case and know exactly what the needle in this haystack looks like. Because somebody knows. Somebody has always known. The only question that has mattered for 30 years, is whether that somebody will finally decide that justice matters more than silence. If you're watching this right now, please take a moment and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you'd heard of this case before today. Your engagement keeps this story in front of more people. And more people seeing this story is more pressure on whoever holds the answer to finally step forward. Like the video. Subscribe. Share it. These are not just algorithms. They are acts of advocacy for Missy Witt. Because her story isn't finished yet. There are moments in unsolved murder cases that become fixed points of unbearable meaning. Details so specific, so personal, that they bypass the intellectual processing of the crime and go directly to the gut. For Missy Witt's case, one of those moments is Mary and driving through Fort Smith at 3 o'clock in the morning on December 2nd, 1994. Just driving. Looking. A mother doing the only thing she could do, which was to refuse to stop moving, because stopping meant accepting something she couldn't accept yet. She didn't know, at that moment, that Missy had already been taken from the city. She didn't know that the trail of blood across the parking lot had pointed toward a car that was already well beyond the city limits, heading into darkness. She was circling a city her daughter had already been taken out of, searching for someone who was 40 miles away by then, in the hands of a man who had planned this or stumbled into it, and who felt safe enough to drive deep into the Ozarks and leave what he had done in the cold ground. The morning came, and Mary made the call. Fort Smith police responded with the kind of urgency that only arrives when a case announces itself immediately as serious. They were not treating this as a runaway. They were not suggesting she probably just stayed at a friend's house. They could feel, in the absence of context, in the details of the car left behind, and the absence of any contact, that something had happened. And when the car was found on December 5th, and the blood was identified, and the earring and the hair clip and the keys with Missy on the keychain were cataloged into evidence, the word abduction was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. In the days immediately following, investigators moved fast. They canvassed the bowling alley and surrounding businesses. They interviewed everyone who had been at Bowling World that Thursday evening. They sought security footage, only to discover there was none in the parking lot. They spoke with league members, with staff, with regulars. They built a timeline as precise as the available information would allow, and they ran into the same wall that has defined this case ever since. The two witnesses who were right there, and who have never been found. This is worth lingering on, because it is not just strange, it is genuinely baffling in a way that investigators have been unable to explain in 30 years. A loud altercation, a violent struggle, a woman being struck and dragged to a vehicle in a public parking lot with multiple people nearby. And of all those people, the only two who were close enough to have directly witnessed it, a man smoking on the sidewalk and a family crossing the lot, vanished as completely as Missy herself in the aftermath. Not into danger, just into their lives. Into the ordinary machinery of going home, putting the kids to bed, forgetting a Thursday evening at a bowling alley. Or perhaps not forgetting. Perhaps knowing exactly what they saw and being afraid of what that knowledge meant. People don't always come forward because coming forward feels dangerous. Because it means being interviewed, being on record, being in the orbit of something violent and unresolved. Because sometimes the easier thing is to tell yourself that what you saw probably doesn't matter, that the police probably already know, that someone else will come forward. No one else did. Investigators have made the identification of those witnesses a priority in every public appeal around this case. The physical descriptions are precise enough that these individuals should be identifiable. A short male with a mustache and glasses, blue shirt, jeans, brown boots, white or light-colored baseball cap. A short blonde woman with fluffy hair, tan or light-colored striped sweater, accompanied by a taller man and a child between 8 and 10 years old. In a city of 73,000 people in December 1994, these are not vague descriptions. These are people that someone who was at Bowling World that evening would likely recognize. Think about this directly. If you were bowling at Bowling World on South 36th Street on the evening of December 1st, 1994, or if someone in your family was, think about whether you remember seeing a man smoking outside, or a family with a child crossing the parking lot. Think about whether you ever said anything to yourself, or to someone else, in the days after Missy disappeared, about whether you'd been there that night. That memory is not too old to be useful. Investigators want to talk to anyone who was present that evening, for any reason. In those early days of the investigation, the Fort Smith police were also doing something that no investigative framework at the time was well equipped to handle. They were trying to profile a killer in a world before behavioral profiling of violent offenders was a standard tool in most local police departments. The FBI had behavioral science resources, but their deployment to cases like this in 1994 was not automatic. It took time, it took escalation, it took the kind of pressure that only came when cases either attracted sustained attention or reached a dead end urgent enough to require outside assistance. When the FBI did come in, first in the mid-1990s and again, more formally, in the 2019 reinvestigation, they brought exactly the kind of analytical framework that the original investigation had been missing. The profiling of the offender, the assessment of the disposal site, the behavioral reading of the trophy taking, and critically, the mapping of the crime against the known crimes of suspects like Vines and Crouch and Swearingen. The reinvestigation in 2019 was not simply a matter of dusting off old files and running new tests. Agents Allen and Gay approached it with genuine intent to solve the case. They conducted new interviews. They revisited evidence that had been in storage for over 2 decades. They applied genealogical DNA analysis to the biological material that had been collected in 1994 and 1995. They went back to Turner Bend with dogs. They pursued the Charles Ray Vines connection as far as it could be pursued, right up to Vines's deathbed. And they found things. They found things that haven't been fully disclosed, because active investigations protect certain information from public release in order to preserve the integrity of any eventual prosecution. What can be said is that the 2019 reinvestigation produced new leads, that the forensic work ordered during that reinvestigation was, as of the documentary's filming, still being processed, that the agencies involved, Fort Smith PD, the FBI, multiple county sheriff departments, remain actively engaged. That is not boilerplate. That is meaningful. Cases that are truly cold do not have active multi-agency investigations with FBI involvement and forensic testing pending. Cases that have genuine prospects of resolution do. Meanwhile, a parallel dimension of this story has been unfolding for years, largely outside of official channels. The citizen investigation. The thousands of people who follow the Facebook page, the Reddit threads, the podcast episodes, the true crime community that has devoted significant collective intelligence to this case. Most of what that community produces is speculative, and investigators have to manage the relationship between public fascination and official investigation carefully. Too much public discussion of specific evidence can contaminate potential witnesses or tip-off suspects. Too little engagement with the public costs you the eyes and ears of thousands of people who might have something useful. The balance that LaDonna Humphrey and the investigators have struck is to keep the public focused on the actionable, the 2 witnesses, the watch, the tip line. Not to speculate endlessly about suspects or theories, but to circulate the information that has a direct probability of producing a tangible result. Because the lesson of cold cases solved by public tips is consistent. The break usually comes from someone who was always in the periphery of the story, who knew something small that turned out to be large, who came forward because they finally saw the case on a screen and recognized something or someone. The Hulu documentary gave this case a global screen. The episode about Missy Witt was watched by people in countries that had never seen an Arkansas parking lot or a stretch of the Ozark National Forest. And every one of those viewers is a potential conduit to someone who knows something. This is how cold cases die, not from lack of evidence alone, but from silence accumulating until the people who hold information convince themselves that the information is no longer relevant. It is relevant. It will always be relevant. A murder is not subject to an expiration date. The responsibility of the person who did this did not diminish over 30 years. And the responsibility of anyone who witnessed something, or heard something, or knows something, that responsibility is also still there. Still waiting. Still requiring an answer. Think about Mary Witt. Think about the years she lived after December 1st, 1994. Think about what it meant to raise a daughter alone, to build a life together, to leave a note on a kitchen counter that ended by saying she loved her, and to have that be the last ordinary moment between them. Think about what Mary carried every day until she died, and what she would have given for a name, for an arrest, for someone to stand in a courtroom and be held accountable for what they did to her Missy. She never got that. Mary Witt died without justice for her daughter. That is the single most devastating fact in this entire story, and it is a fact that the person responsible for Missy's murder created. Not circumstance. Not fate. A person. A person who is, or was somewhere in the world, living the life they chose, while Mary Witt aged and grieved and waited, and eventually died still waiting. That person needs to be named. And the path to naming them runs directly through the two witnesses in that parking lot, through the Mickey Mouse watch, through the biological evidence currently in analysis, and through every single person watching this who might carry a single piece of information they have not yet shared. There is a photograph that has become inseparable from the public memory of this case. Missy Witt, smiling. That open, unguarded, completely present smile that people who knew her say captures her exactly. Not a posed smile, not a performance for the camera, but a real one. The kind that takes up the whole face. The kind that makes whoever is looking at it feel, for a moment, like they knew her too. That photograph has been on billboards on the most traveled roads in Fort Smith, Arkansas. It has been on Facebook pages viewed millions of times. It has been in newspaper stories and television segments and documentary films. It has been printed on flyers and held up at vigils and reproduced in articles in every major American news outlet. Missy Witt is, in the deepest sense of that overused word, iconic. Not famous in the way that people seek fame, but permanent in the way that injustice that is never resolved becomes permanent, etched into the identity of a community and a case. And still, the photograph is accompanied by an open question. A blank where a name should be. A case file that ends mid-sentence. The Hulu documentary, At Wit's End, The Hunt for a Killer, brought this story to a scale that even the most sustained local advocacy could not have achieved alone. 4 episodes, produced with the full resources of ABC News Studios and Scott Free Productions, told the complete arc of Missy's life and death and the 30-year investigation that followed with a level of detail and access that changed the conversation around the case. Investigators who had never spoken on camera before sat for interviews. Evidence that had been discussed only in general terms was examined specifically. The behavioral analysis of the crime, the suspects, the forensic reinvestigation, all of it, laid out for a national and international audience. The documentary's executive producer, Ridley Scott, is not someone who attaches his name to projects lightly. He is one of the most accomplished filmmakers of the past half-century, and his production company's decision to invest in Missy's story was a signal to the entertainment world and the true crime world simultaneously. This case matters. This woman matters. And the investigation into who killed her is not historical record. It is ongoing present-tense reporting. The public reaction to the documentary was significant. Social media engagement around the case spiked dramatically in August 2024 when the series premiered. The tip line received new calls. Investigators fielded new leads. People who had heard Missy's name in passing or heard it for the first time began doing their own research, began asking questions, began sharing the story with people in their own networks. The ripple effect of sustained public attention on cold cases is not myth. It is documented. Cases get solved when enough people know enough to connect the right dots. There was also, in the documentary, a quiet and deeply affecting thread about what the case had meant to the people who had spent years working it. J.C. Ryder, who was the lead investigator, who walked that parking lot and stood in that forest and carried the weight of Missy's unsolved murder through his entire career and well beyond, spoke not as a retired detective reflecting on professional failure, but as a man who had made a personal promise and was still keeping it. The language of obligation, of debt, of moral commitment. Not professional pride. Something more personal than that. Ryder said, in words that have stayed with everyone who heard them. It's all I've ever wanted out of this, to see justice served. That sentence, from a man who gave his career to this case, and then kept working it in retirement. A man who, by now, has spent more years trying to solve this crime than Missy Witt was alive when it happened. The depth of commitment that represents is difficult to articulate. It is the opposite of institutional indifference. It is a human being who decided that this girl's death was his responsibility, and who has never rescinded that decision. And LaDonna Humphrey, whose advocacy work has been the connective tissue between the investigation and the public for years, carries a similar quality of commitment. She has described her reason for caring the way people describe reasons that don't require external justification. Because it is obvious, because it is necessary, because justice is not an abstraction but a practical obligation that someone has to stand behind. She was 19, Humphrey said. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend. It could be any of us next time. The billboard campaign that all the Lost Girls launched in 2021 was, in its way, a declaration of that principle made visible. For billboards, busy intersections, Missy's face at driver's eye level on the roads that Fort Smith uses every day, not as memorial, but as reminder, not as mourning, but as demand. Every person who drove past those billboards was being asked, not gently, but directly, whether they knew anything, whether they had always known something, whether 30 years was long enough to stay quiet. Some people called after seeing the billboards. New tips were generated. Whether those tips have produced actionable evidence is not public information. Active investigations protect operational details, but the principle was validated. Public pressure, consistently applied, produces results. And then there is the watch. The Mickey Mouse watch with the brown band. It has become the most symbolically powerful object in this case, the thing that represents both the personal identity of who Missy was, a 19-year-old girl who wore a Mickey Mouse watch because she wanted to, because it was cheerful and personal and hers, and the hard evidentiary reality of what the killer did. He took it, deliberately, specifically, from the body of a girl he had murdered. He carried it away from that forest, and he put it somewhere, and it has been somewhere ever since. Investigators believe that finding the watch could be the break that breaks the case. Not because the watch itself, 3 decades later, would necessarily yield fingerprints or DNA that current technology could process successfully, but because whoever has it, or whoever knew someone who had it, or whoever saw it in someone's possession, that person connects directly to the crime in a way that cannot be explained away. A Mickey Mouse watch with a brown band from 1994 is not a common item. It is specific. It is recognizable. Someone gave it away or sold it, or displayed it, or mentioned it, or left it in a box for a family member to find decades later. The chain of custody on that object leads somewhere. The $29,000 reward, announced in December 2023 by all the Lost Girls and the Who Killed Missy Witt investigative team, is the largest cash incentive this case has ever carried. $29,000, $1,000 for each year since Missy was taken. It is not a small amount. It is a significant amount that makes the economic argument for coming forward as strong as the moral argument. If you know where that watch is, or if you know something that leads to an arrest and conviction, you need to call 1-800-440-1922 right now. That reward is real. That money is waiting for whoever provides the critical information that finally closes this case. 3 decades is a long time. It is also, in the mathematics of justice, not very long at all. Criminals have been convicted for crimes committed 50, 60 years prior. Evidence has been processed, and cases have been closed after timelines that dwarf 30 years. The people who know things in this case are aging, yes. Memories are changing, yes. But they have not vanished, any more than Missy has vanished from the public record of Fort Smith. And the biological evidence preserved from 1994 and 1995 does not age in the way that memory ages. DNA does not become less itself with time. It waits. There is one more element of this story that we have not yet addressed. It is perhaps the hardest part. Not the crime, not the suspects, not the evidence, but the question of meaning. What does it mean that a 19-year-old girl who did everything right, who was kind and ambitious and loved back, who was going to see her mother on a Thursday evening in December, was murdered and left in a forest, and the person who did it has lived their entire life since then without consequence? It means that justice is not automatic, that it does not arrive on its own, that it requires active, sustained human effort, the effort of detectives who don't stop when they retire, of advocates who adopt causes that aren't theirs by birth but become theirs by conviction, of journalists and filmmakers and communities who refuse to let a story end without its proper conclusion. It means that every person who shares this video, every person who calls the tip line, every person who tells someone else about Missy Witt, every one of them is part of the mechanism that justice depends on. Not abstractly, not symbolically, actually, mechanically, in the way that pressure applied to a case produces outcomes that silence doesn't. Missy Witt was born on April 20th, 1975. She was 19 years old. She wore a Mickey Mouse watch. She wanted to be a dental hygienist. She loved her mother. She was going to see her best friend the next morning. She never got there. But the story of who took her there, and who took her from everything she had, is still being written. And the next chapter depends entirely on someone deciding that what they know is worth saying out loud. In the fall of 2023, on the 29th anniversary of Missy Witt's abduction, the streets of Fort Smith, Arkansas were changed. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but changed in the quiet, persistent way that matters most in cases like this one. Billboards carrying Missy's face, her case details, and the tip line number went up on the city's most traveled corridors. For billboards. Simple. Unavoidable. A reminder addressed to a city that had lived with this question for nearly 3 decades. Do you know who did this? The billboard stayed up. The tip line stayed active. And in December 2023, the reward was increased to $29,000, a number chosen deliberately, a number that means something to everyone in Fort Smith who has counted those years. The partners behind the reward increase, all the Lost Girls, and the Who Killed Missy Witt investigative team, were not making a gesture. They were making a bet. A bet that somewhere in the 30 years of accumulated silence, there is a person who has been waiting for sufficient reason to say what they know. Sufficient protection. Sufficient reward. Sufficient pressure. $29,000 is that reason, waiting to be claimed. And then, in August 2024, the national conversation that advocates had been trying to generate for years finally arrived. The Hulu documentary. The press coverage. The millions of viewers who spent 4 episodes inside the Missy Witt investigation and emerged knowing not just the facts of the case, but the texture of it. The cold of that December parking lot. The hollow echo of a bowling alley where a mother sat unaware. The deep silence of the Ozark National Forest where 2 hunters walked into something that would follow them the rest of their lives. The show produced results. Not a conviction, not yet, but results. Tips. Calls. Renewed attention from people across the country who had connections to Fort Smith, connections to the case, connections to the suspects or the witnesses or the geography, in ways that they had never before had the context to recognize as significant. Every one of those connections is now in a file, being worked by investigators who have been waiting for exactly this kind of acceleration. Because this is the thing about cold cases that most people don't fully appreciate until they've watched one evolve in real time. They can move from stalled to solved in a very short period of time once the right information arrives. Not slowly, not with gradual accumulation, suddenly. One phone call, one piece of physical evidence, one person deciding that what they know cannot stay inside them any longer. And 30 years of investigation, 30 years of preserved evidence, 30 years of built forensic capability all comes to bear on that single moment. Cases that looked impossible crack like a windshield, all at once. The investigators working this case have demonstrated, repeatedly and at length, that they have not given up. The FBI reinvestigation launched in 2019. The canine testing at Turner Bend 27 years after Missy's body was found there. The genealogical DNA analysis being applied to preserved biological evidence. The formal collaboration between the Fort Smith Police Department, Crawford County, Sebastian County, Van Buren Police Department, and the FBI. Multiple agencies with multiple resources and a shared commitment to the same outcome. These are not the behaviors of people who have filed something away. These are the behaviors of people who believe the case is solvable and are actively working toward solving it. There is something to be said, too, for the significance of the Hulu documentary being produced in 2024 at all. Documentary films of this scope and quality, produced by networks and production companies with major resources, do not get made about cases that are considered truly cold. They get made about cases that are active, that have new developments, that have something happening beneath the surface that is worth documenting in real time. The production of At Wit's End, The Hunt for a Killer is, in its own way, a signal. The investigation is alive. There is motion in it. Something is happening. The documentary also served one function that no amount of local advocacy could replicate. It introduced the case to people outside of Arkansas who have no direct connection to Fort Smith, but who might know someone who does. Fort Smith is not a small village. People move. People travel. People who were in that bowling alley parking lot in December 1994 may now live in Texas or California or Florida or overseas. The two witnesses, the man with the mustache and the family with the young child, might be anywhere. And a documentary on a major streaming platform is how you reach anyone, anywhere. Now let's be specific, one final time, about what investigators are asking for. Not in general terms. Specifically, they want to know the identity of the short male with a mustache and glasses who was standing outside Bowling World on the evening of December 1st, 1994, wearing a blue shirt, jeans, brown boots, and a white or light-colored baseball cap. He was smoking. He was on the sidewalk near the front entrance. He almost certainly heard the altercation between Missy and her abductor, and may have seen part or all of it. If you are that person, if you were there, investigators are not looking to prosecute you for anything. They are looking to hear what you remember. After 30 years, a memory is still a memory, and it still matters. They want to know the identity of the couple who was crossing the parking lot with their young child that same evening. The woman was short and blonde with fluffy hair, wearing a tan or light-colored striped sweater. The man with her was taller. Their child was 8 to 10 years old, which means that child is now in their late 30s or early 40s. If you were that child, if you remember being at a bowling alley with your parents on a Thursday evening in December 1994 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, please call the number. Your memory of that night could be the thread that unravels everything. They want the Mickey Mouse watch. If you have ever seen it, if someone you know ever had it, if it has ever appeared in your life in any context since December 1994, that is information worth sharing. Call 1-800-440-1922 or email whokilledmissywitt@gmail.com. The tip line is answered. The investigators are real. The reward is real. They want any information at all about the crime itself, about who might have been driving through that parking lot that evening, about anyone who behaved strangely in the days or weeks following Missy's disappearance, about anyone who seemed to know things they shouldn't have known, about anyone who had a sudden change in behavior or demeanor in December 1994 or January 1995 in the Fort Smith area. 30 years have not made those memories irrelevant. They have only made them more precious. Missy Witt was born on April 20th, 1975, in Fort Smith, Arkansas. She grew up alongside her mother, Mary Ann. She was a student and a worker and a dreamer and a daughter. She was the kind of person that a city wants its young people to be: ambitious, kind, responsible, connected to her family, building something. She was going to help people. She was going to be the person in the dental chair telling you it would be okay and meaning it, because she was that kind of person. She was 19 years old when a man took her from a parking lot and drove her into the dark. She was identified through her dental records, the records from the clinic where she worked, where she had already begun the career she would never complete. Mary Ann Witt spent the rest of her life looking for justice and never found it. She is gone now, too. But she did not go without witnesses. She did not go without leaving behind a community of people who heard her, who understood what she was asking, who have carried the demand for justice forward in her absence. LaDonna Humphrey carries it. J.C. Ryder carries it. The investigators at the Fort Smith Police Department and the FBI carry it. And now, the millions of people who have watched the documentary or heard the story or seen the billboards or listened to the podcast episodes or read the articles or watched this video carry it too. This is not a cold case in the way people use that phrase to mean finished, filed, forgotten. It is an open case. An active case. A case with a tip line that still rings and investigators who still answer and forensic evidence that still sits in analysis and a reward that still waits for the right person to claim it. The person who killed Missy Witt is either dead or they are alive somewhere in this country, in this world. If they are alive, They have been living with what they did for 30 years. 30 years of ordinary days built on the foundation of an extraordinary evil. 30 years of getting up in the morning and going to sleep at night, knowing something that everyone who loved Missy Witt has spent 30 years desperate to know. Time does not erase responsibility. Distance does not erase it. Age does not erase it. A name has not yet been put to this crime, but the crime itself is as present as it was in December 1994. As permanent. As demanding. Missy deserves a name. She deserves a courtroom. She deserves the thing that Mary and Witt spent her whole remaining life asking for and never received. Justice. If you know anything at all, call 1-800-440-1922 right now. Email whokilledmissywitt@gmail.com. Leave an anonymous tip if that is what it takes. But call. Because someone knows something. Someone has always known something. And after 30 years, after a mother died waiting, after a community bore this silence as long as communities can bear anything, it is time. It is past time. If this story moved you, if Missy's name is going to stay with you the way it should, please like this video right now, subscribe to this channel, and share this with every single person in your network. Not for the algorithm. For Missy. Every view is one more person who might know something. Every share is one more possibility that the right eyes land on this story and the right phone call gets made. The tip line is 1-800-440-1922. The email is whokilledmissywitt@gmail.com. The reward is $29,000 for critical information leading to an arrest and conviction. Missy Witt was 19 years old. She wore a Mickey Mouse watch. She loved her mother. She was going to see her best friend the next morning. She never got there. But the story of who stopped her from getting there is still unfinished. And unfinished stories, in the hands of enough people who refuse to look away, have a way of finally finding their ending. For Missy.